being here. Thank you very much. You know what's so funny is my aunt and uncle put my mom and dad on and when my aunt from Colorado came down for Margaret's for her sister's funeral, half of the church she wanted to let us know from dad, but the gate was locked. So we found Jules and he unlocked the gate. And as we're walking over from Episcopal across the ladder,
Brooks Robinson.
my aunt just, you know, I know
Good story.
stuffing.
Good story.
Like I said, everybody involved.
I told you I like Billy Martin. Anyway,
Yeah.
I told you.
Yeah.
How you been?
Okay.
For the mysteries.
So I had sworn yesterday, didn't stick. Okay, didn't stick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're about 1,000 foot higher. I'm out in Maine. Yeah. Yesterday morning, I got up, it was rain. It wasn't raining, it was just drizzling. So I let my dog see the come on.
Thanks for doing this, Max. Thank you.
You know, I really want to go down there. You know? And I say, yeah, you do. I'll let you right back in. I have a towel right by the door that I can dry her off. And I said, I promise I will stay right here and let you right back in. I don't want you having incidents.
Yeah, not the best time for dogs. Right?
Does she
Do I need to test this, Max? Test, 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 test. Oh, Jesse's doing it. Test, test, test. Check, 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 check. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. Check, 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 check. Somebody say something to me. Am I good? Okay, thank you. Should we run over and tell everybody to get over here?
Well, she doesn't drive at night, so I called her and asked her if she wanted to go to both the Shrew Tuesday and.
Look at James, he bought a new pack of these.
I got them. I forgot where I put them. Clean the board, so. That's better.
Hey, I blame it on you anyway. She says, it's Jane's fault, isn't it, Mom?
I'll run over there and yell at everybody. Mm-hmm. Okay. 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 Really? From an Anglican perspective, I hope? So, okay, good. Yeah, yeah. From a historical perspective, good. Good, good, good. Hi, everyone. Good to see you all again. So I'm on this because we're live streaming this too. So if when you have questions or you want to say anything, If you wouldn't mind coming to the microphone and saying it here so people can see you and hear you, okay? Otherwise, people live streaming can't hear you, okay? So if you can do that. And if you're not comfortable doing that, it's okay. I'll just repeat what you said, okay? So that's good. All right. So happy to see you all. Let's start with, so I had everybody who was here last week sign up. If you weren't here last week, and just so I know who else is here, if you could write your names down. I'm looking for something else to write on. But here I have the actual official sign up. If you are thinking about if you already know that you want to get received by the bishop or confirmed when the bishop comes on April the 14th. And again, if you have never had hands laid on you by a bishop, then you are eligible for this, okay? We're going to talk more about the difference between reception and confirmation, which isn't much, but when we get to the sacramental class, we'll talk about what confirmation is in the church, and I'll just play my hand beforehand a little bit. We don't quite know what to do with confirmation anymore, because now that we realize that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirmation was part of baptism at the beginning of the church, we don't quite know what to do with that. So we'll talk about all that. But if you already know that you want to get received or confirmed, this is the information that we need, okay? So I'll pass that around. So this is only if you know for sure that you're getting received or confirmed. And I'll have that each week for you to look at, okay? Does anybody have any questions about that? West. Her question was, should she write her chosen name or her birth name? So you should put your birth name down because it goes in the files like that, but then put in parentheses what name you want us to use, okay? And we'll put that on your stuff. And you may not, there may be questions on there you can't answer. So for example, baptism information is on there. If you can't remember that, just fill in your other stuff and you can get it later, okay? And it's good enough, if you can remember like the year you were baptized, that's good enough, okay? If you haven't been baptized and you're thinking about getting baptized, then we need to talk one-on-one, okay? Good? Everybody good? Does that make sense? Okay. But I don't have a piece of paper for you to sign up if you're here for the first time. So I'm going to just have you, sure. Thank you. It's pretty embarrassing that the rector doesn't have a piece of paper. Okay, so this is just if you're here, if you weren't here last week, just so I know everybody who came. But I know you were here, Dino, but you can pass that around. Okay. All right. So first of all, any questions from last week? Anything that you went home and said, what in the world was he talking about that? Anything that you had a later thought about that you want to talk about? Jennifer? Is that you, Jennifer? Yeah.
So this is a repeat question. I'm still having trouble with the time period, like 100 years after Jesus, when it became more Christianity and not a sect of Judaism.
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Okay, so so after Jesus died, this group formed around what Jesus talked about, and of course that group was Jewish, just like Jesus was and always was. Around, and we don't know exactly, but around the year 100 is when people in the Jewish community started saying, what these Jesus people are talking about doesn't sound Jewish to me. And there starts to be all this tension around that, and the tension there you can feel in the Gospel of John. So if you read the Gospel of John, which we believe was written around the year 100, you can see the tension there. all that language in there, that sounds really pejorative, that when John says the Jews did this and the Jews did that, well, of course, they were Jews. So he was talking about his own people. But this tension is really growing by then. So by about 110, so we know in 110 that there were bishops for the first time. So I would say by 110 that the split must have been pretty much over between Christians within Judaism and them getting forced out of the synagogue. So between 100 and 110 is probably our best guess. So you all understand the question, when did Christianity was just one other sect within Judaism until about 110, and then they were totally pushed out of the synagogues. That is why we are really careful with texts from the Gospel of John in this church, because I can't give that speech to everybody when you hear something from the Gospel of John and it sounds so pejorative against Judaism, because they're in this tension and this fight with them. That's why it sounds like that. But I can't explain that to everybody all the time. So we're really, really careful with those texts. It's why we don't use the Passion narrative in the Gospel of John on Good Friday here, because it's impossible to explain to people what's going on. You know, that's what's going on there, and that's why John's talking like that. But of course, what that's done is created this whole atmosphere of anti-Semitism, people saying that the Jews killed Jesus, etc. And that a lot of that comes out of the Gospel of John. But that's because there's all this tension between them as they're fighting about whether they're actually Jewish or not. Okay? Thanks for bringing that up, Jennifer. Anything else? Lisa?
I would like you to talk about how they communicated since, and what the society was like, since obviously they didn't have telephones and cell phones and internet and blah, blah. I mean, how is this spreading? How are they gathered and sharing?
Okay. So that, actually, the Bible probably gives us more information about that than anything else, because Paul wrote all of those epistles, and all of the epistles in the Bible are Paul's letters to all of these churches that he started all over the Roman Empire. So that's how they are communicating mostly, is letters that they're writing, that he's writing to groups of people. And you see in those letters they're having the same kind of fights that we're having today. But that's how most of it is. So Paul went to all of these villages and went to all these places and presented this whole idea around Christianity. And he and then the other evangelists are the people that really spread this whole thing. Okay? Good? Anything else? All right. So last week we talked about the Reformation, that we were right on the verge of the Reformation, and we talked about all the reasons why it was so important for this to happen. One of the things that I did not mention last week that I want to make clear, and that is the Great Schism. So the actual break between the Western and Eastern part of Christianity officially occurred in 1054. That's when the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, broke away from the Western Church, the Roman Church, and it was official. But as you probably picked up last week, I'm going to suggest to you that break almost always existed. The theology in the Eastern Church was always very different than in the West. We talked about baptism and original sin. Remember all those things and how different the churches were approaching that. But the official break occurred in 1054. So that's when the Orthodox Church had their own patriarch, and the Western Church they called the Bishop of Rome the Pope by 1054. Okay, so just so you get that. I think that's important because Phyllis Tickle wrote this book about this, short read. It's called The Great Emergence. And Phyllis's basic theory is that every 500 years, the church goes through a major shift. And her thesis is, so the first 500 years would have been right around the fall of the Roman Empire. And at that point, Christianity, as we talked about last week, changed tremendously because Rome wasn't holding all this together. And in those, what we used to call the Dark Ages, Christianity was understood and carried through the people way differently than before, and the church totally changed. And then 1054 is the official break of the Eastern and Western Church. So that's the next big change. And we're going to talk now about the Reformation around 1500. That's the next big change. And Phyllis's argument is that we are in this reformational period in the church right now. And the church is really changing right now. And of course, I totally agree with that. And my hope is that Grace St. Paul's is on the top of that wave of this new reformation that I think the church is going through, and that we are displaying where I hope the church is going. So, okay? All right. So, okay, we talked about all that. Let's just get in here. Let's see, where should we start? Let's start with the Reformations. So, what I want you to remember is that there were really three distinct Protestant Reformations, and they really were quite different. So you all know the German one because that's the one everybody always talks about. So who's that? Right. So Martin Luther. Who, of course, also always stayed Roman Catholic, was the instigator of that. And this is a really theological movement. You know what Luther's upset about. I made a joke about it this morning in announcements, talking about the fact that we're going to give you indulgences if you pay for them Tuesday at our party. That's one of the things that Luther was upset about, that the church was literally selling indulgences so that people could save their own souls. And that was making Luther crazy. You all know about the 95 Thesis that he tacked on the door of the cathedral. I can't spell. So he had a list of a lot of stuff, and you can read about all of those. But we talked about a lot of them last week and what had happened in the church, and that the church was doing these masses that were non-participatory, and what people were doing was paying the priest to pray for them or to pray for, and all of that stuff is really upsetting Martin Luther, okay? The other part of the Reformation is the Genevan one. And does anybody know any names associated with that? Yes, that's it, John Calvin. I still can't spell. Zwingli is the other person that's most associated with the Genevan part of the movement. And this is also a very theological movement. John Calvin is very much a thinker like Augustine of Hippo. He believes in double predestination. He believes that we know beforehand, that God's already decided beforehand who's going to be saved and who isn't. Very much in the same line of the Augustinian stuff that we talked about last week. In the Genevan part of the Reformation, all the Pope stuff is totally thrown out. Church becomes this. Not that, this. You go into church and there are pews and there is a pulpit, and that's it. No stained glass, no pictures of saints, no table, altar. You all know why I call this a table and not an altar, right? You get that? Altar obviously is a sacrificial word, and what we're trying to do here is take us back to the early church when communion and the whole experience here was about bringing people together in community and eating together and having a meal together and remembering what Jesus said and bringing us all together there. As we talked about last week, this became a totally sacrificial thing where you're remembering what Jesus did as something to atone for our sins. And that is the other reason why I call this a table, because we gave up all that sacrificial stuff in the Jewish tradition way, way before Jesus. And then some guy named Anselm of Canterbury brought all that back in the 10th century. But we're not going there now. Okay. So in England, the whole Reformation was not theological at all. It was really a constitutional crisis. Only much later did we get into any theology in England. So we'll talk more about that as we go here, okay? So let's see. So we talked about Luther. So that break happened around 1517. We talked about the indulgences. Luther talks about salvation coming by faith through grace alone and not through any human merit. And that is a major part of what of Luther's whole idea. And central to that is the idea of sola scriptura, the Bible only. In other words, Luther's saying, I don't know where all this stuff came from that the Catholic Church is doing, but all we need is the Bible. And how we got to this place where we talked about this last week, how the church was doing all these things that had nothing to do with what was in the Bible. So he's supporting this idea that we need to get back to what the Bible says, and we don't need anything else. We don't need no stinking priests. We don't need no bishops. All we need is the Bible, and everything's going to be fine. And remember, he was Augustine, a monk. So, I mean, he's talking about himself here. So this is coming from the inside out. He encouraged congregational participation in the liturgy. He encouraged people to receive communion in church. And remember, everybody stopped doing that. He encouraged singing hymns together and more participation in everything. In the Genevan Reformation, John Calvin in France is talking about double predestination, as we talked about. One of Calvin's favorite phrases is the total depravity of man, that we all are terrible sinners and there's nothing that we can do about that. We talked about the pulpit. Ulrich Zwingli in the Scandinavian places is preaching against the adoration of saints. Remember how saints became so important in the church? He wants to get rid of relics and, again, indulgences. He also is a big guy talking about we need to get rid of all that. He denounced the sacramental view of the Eucharist. He's also trying to get back to what communion was at the beginning. He also just happened to denounce clerical celibacy, which is kind of interesting. So out of Zwingli's part of the Reformation comes the Presbyterian movement and then the Anabaptist movement. In the Anabaptist movement, they reinstitute the baptism of believers. They do not baptize children. Interestingly, both Luther and Calvin denounced Zwingli on that. So there's another split happening around all of that, okay? Meanwhile, in England, they went through the entire Reformation without hardly anything changing, okay? Kings are battling for ecclesiastical power. By 1450, the king sent a letter to the Pope and told him who to appoint in each bishop position in England. And it was very few times that the Pope did not do that. By the 16th century, England is a highly religious country compared to the rest of the continent, the exact opposite of what's happening right now. And of course, remember that these are all theocracies, that the church intervened in people's lives in every way possible. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about this. There was apparently not much dissatisfaction with the church at this point in England. 1509, Henry VIII comes to the throne. Lutheranism has already hatched, and it's becoming a big influence at Cambridge. And it influences a guy at Cambridge named Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer will become very important later. Henry uses Lutherans as allies for political purposes, but he never finds any fondness in any of the Reformed doctrine. Henry's a Catholic through and through, and he never really changed from that. There was a blue-collar movement in England going on at the time called the Lollards, and they, by contrast, see Lutheranism as a scholarly movement. So there's this little bit of pull and push there, but Henry is not part of any of that. A guy named Thomas More is enlisted by Henry to refute Lutheran doctrine. He wants reform, but not orthodox and spiritual reform. So by the 1520s, there's a cardinal named Thomas Wolsey, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he tells Henry, he suggests to Henry that he can have complete control of the church within England, even more than he already does. He becomes Henry's right-hand man. Wolsey has incredible power and suggests to Henry that he can have the same power. He's vastly unpopular in England. Any movement that is very right or very left in England is always vastly unpopular, and we'll talk about that as we go through England. So Wolsey shows Henry that church and state could really be one in England, totally. All right, then we get to the divorce. So first of all, remember that the term divorce is not like today's term. A divorce meant an annulment. It meant that the Pope was saying that your marriage never existed. So if it never existed, then you can marry, obviously, if you're not really married. So Henry asks for an annulment. Keep in mind that this happened all the time. It still does, actually, in the church. People asked, higher ups, mucky mucks, asked for annulments all the time. And the Pope most often gave people annulments. It was a day-to-day request. So if Henry had gotten his annulment, England would have totally stayed Roman Catholic. But what he got instead was total power because of what Wolsey's suggesting to him. So by 1529, Henry looks for a theological argument to convince the Pope that he should get this annulment. And he appoints Thomas Cranmer to help him with this. Cranmer says that his marriage is null and void because Henry was married to another relative in the family, and that should have been illegal to begin with. So he tries to argue from a practical standpoint that the marriage shouldn't exist. And so he's trying to hold the kingdom together. Nothing is moving the Pope on this, Pope Clement. So Henry already secretly marries Anne Boleyn, okay? And the Pope finds out about this, so he excommunicates Henry from the church. Even at that point, there's still very little resistance in England. So Henry just continues on the same route, and in 1534, just a couple years after he secretly married Anne Boleyn, the Act of Supremacy is passed in England, and that says that the only supreme head of the church is the king. So you see what Henry's done here. He gets kicked out of the Roman church. But he doesn't really want to be out of the church, so he just says, okay, I'm the Pope too. So that's kind of what he does. He just makes himself the supreme head of the church, and that's what the Act of Supremacy says. So what I want you to get out of this, though, is that nothing changes in England. All the same priests are there, all the same bishops are there. The Mass is exactly the same as it was before the Act of Supremacy and before Henry did this. Nothing changed. The theology was all the same. It's basically a Catholic church in England. It's just that the Pope has kicked Henry out. So that continues until we get to the issue of the monasteries. And this is when the people in England really got upset about what was going on. Because Henry started messing with the monasteries because he needed money. So he started taking over the monasteries, and that really upset people. Okay, and that was the only thing that really happened under Henry VIII. So if you were taught in school that Henry VIII formed the Anglican Church, that is total bull. England never changed. It stayed Catholic. It's just that Henry was excommunicated, okay? So between 1547 and 1553, Cranmer begins to kind of try to define what this church is. And the first book of Common Prayer is written in 1549. After Henry VIII comes Lady Jane Grey, and nothing much happens again. Mary I comes into power. She's there from 1553 to 1558. Under Mary, some of you know her by another name, which you feel free to say right now. Yes, Bloody Mary. So under Bloody Mary, England is totally Catholic again. She pushes even harder for no one to do anything in England except continue to stay in the Roman Catholic practice. And of course, she hasn't been excommunicated. So at that point, England, again, is totally Catholic, even more so. And as you all know, Mary gets rid of anybody who has any Protestant roots. So that happens, okay? Totally Catholic. Elizabeth I comes next, 1558, all the way to 1603, and it is under Elizabeth I where Anglicanism begins to form for the first time. And under her, England tries to define what this Anglicanism is all about and why they are different. The thing that sticks, that people remember from this time, is the phrase via media, and that is the idea that there is a middle way for us to go. We don't have to take all of this Protestant Reformation stuff, and we don't have to totally stay Catholic. We can create this middle way where we take some of the benefits from the Reformation and we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater like has happened in the Genevan part of this, where this becomes the church. So under Elizabeth is saying, so let's hold on to the sacramental part of Roman Catholicism, but let's also think about this Reformation and why this was necessary, and try to find a middle way. So people could be both Protestant and Catholic in England during Elizabeth I, and they slowly try to put together what that means and what that's all about. All right. As they're trying to define Anglicanism, the guy who becomes most important in this conversation is a guy named Richard Hooker. And he is very important to you because Hooker is the guy that comes up with a way to try to put all this stuff together. And what he says, what Hooker basically says is, we don't want to let go of the ancient tradition of the church. That's important to us. So we want to continue to hold on to that. And Martin Luther is also right. The Bible is central to everything that we're doing. He says, in England, we're going to do both of those. We're going to hold on to Scripture as the centerpiece of what we do, but we also are not going to let go of our communion of saints and what was happening in the church from the early days, our tradition. So he puts both of them together, and then he adds a third leg, and this is the famous three-legged stool that you may have heard about. Scripture is central, tradition is central, and the third piece that Hooker adds is reason. That we're going to use our brains to figure out which parts of this we're going to take and which parts of this we're going to let go, and we're going to come up with a way to have a balanced approach to this whole thing. Scripture, reason, and tradition. To this day, that is the hallmark of Anglicanism and what we are all about. We don't want to let go of Scripture. We don't want to let go of the ancient tradition, but we want to think about it. We want to figure out what this means and how we do that. That's kind of how this happened in England. Okay? Good? All right. So England, after that, falls into civil war in the 1600s. As you all know, there is a Puritan presence in England. As the Puritans get more and more power, they actually abolish the episcopacy and they go totally to the Protestant side of everything. And the Church of England actually ceases to exist in the 1600s. The Puritan movement is not very popular in England because it's despotic. And of course, extremes on either side never held for very long in England, still don't. So by 1662, the Puritans are shoved aside and the Church of England is brought back, and a new prayer book is written in 1662. And folks, that continues to be, to this day, the official prayer book in England, the 1662 prayer book. You think we're struggling with a prayer book from 1979 that we're sitting up here rewriting all the time. They're using the book from 1662, okay? So does that give you kind of a feel for how all that happened? It's nothing like that, at least what I was taught, okay? So, America, let's move to America. We'll just start with, so what was the first settlement in America? Everybody always gets this wrong, so don't answer right away until you think about it. But anybody know? That's it. Who said that? Way to go, Debbie. So everybody always goes to the Mayflower in 1620, right? But the first settlement is Jamestown in 1607. And so Anglicanism was the first denomination to arrive in the United States. And I'll tell you a little bit about what they did in Jamestown. The Church of England that comes to America is very low church. Did we talk about low and high church last week? Not really. So low church means that there's not a lot of accoutrements, that you're basically doing a general service. High church is all the smells and bells that you can imagine. So here in Tucson, St. Philip's is a very high church. It's so high that it's called Anglo-Catholic. And in fact, some ways, St. Philip's is way more Catholic than some Catholic churches are in the way they do everything. And if you've been to St. Philip's, there's incense. St. Michael's and All Angels would be in the same category. There's lots of incense. There's lots of vestments. Priests wear way more than what I wear. There's lots of accoutrements. Low church is let's pray and that's it. We're not going to. In low churches, priests are usually called Mr. or Mrs. There's no title. That's still very much the case in the East Coast of America now. So not everywhere, but in a lot of places. So high church, low church. So the church that comes here is low church. Morning and evening prayer attendance is required daily. There are 2 sermons on Sunday, and communion occurred about once every 3 months. Okay, really low church. From 1607 to 1740, there is an explosive growth of the Church of England in Virginia. The Virginia legislature passes a law that says that no settler can be more than 6 miles from a church. That was a law in Virginia from 1607 to 1740. By 1671, there were 48 parishes in Virginia. Most of those churches are still standing today. After 1700, more and more clergy were educated in America. From 1723 to 1776, our clergy continued to be highly educated, and that is one of the hallmarks of Anglicanism, especially in the American church. And today, our priests are better trained than our English counterparts. Training and education is very important in the American Episcopal Church to this very day, for better or worse. I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm just saying that that's what it is. So most of our clergy were educated at, anybody know of an American religious institution that has Anglican roots? Seabury Western, but this was even before Seabury. Yep, absolutely. Yep, so think in Virginia. Anybody? William and Mary. So College of William and Mary is, of course, Anglican, and almost all of our clergy were educated there. And, of course, William and Mary remains a highly regarded institution to this day. So up to the Revolution, almost all Virginians belonged to the Church of England, okay? It was pretty much a theocracy here, too, in Virginia. And then 30 years later, the 107 parishes in Virginia went down to 35. Does anybody know why that would be? We have this little event here in America in 1776. Yeah, so of course, as we're breaking away from England, there's this church that is called the Church of England, And here it is, and everybody's part of this church. So things got really, really hairy. And during that time, the church almost completely died out, because who wants to be a member of the Church of England when we are separating ourselves from the Church of England? This is also the time in America where there's a strong rise in deism in the male aristocracy, and that is also contributing to the decline. Anybody ever hear of deism? Or Jennifer, do you want to take us? No, that's fine. So yeah, Thomas Jefferson was definitely a deist, as was George Washington, as was James Madison, as was many members. And the idea behind deism is basically, it was a very rational, common sense approach to religion. And the great metaphor for deism is God as the clockmaker, that God makes the clock and then God stands back and just lets the clock run. That God doesn't take any interest in individual events that are happening, that he just starts it. Deism is probably the forerunner of what we might call secular humanism today. And that is very much what's going on in the country in 1776 and beyond. The majority of the founding fathers were deists. They went to church. They went to an Anglican church, but they thought like deists thought. For example, George Washington went to church about once out of every 5 Sundays. George Washington, Ben Franklin, James Madison, John Jay, Patrick Henry, and 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglicans, and they were also deists. So that is the heritage of this country. 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglicans. So I really find it so comical when fundamentalists today say we need to get back to the early days of Christianity. And really? You want to be deists? I don't think you do. But that's interesting. So 45% of clergy in Virginia were pro-patriot during the Revolution, and virtually all the laity were pro-patriot. So that's really interesting too. So those 250 buildings at the beginning of the Revolution went down to 35 by 1810. Okay, so that's what's happening down in Virginia, all right, in that area. In New England, by 1700, there were more Congregationalists than Anglicans. Congregationalists became the major denomination in New England. But there were Anglican churches from Massachusetts to South Carolina. The Anglican Church in America is forming very differently than the one in England. America is obviously pluralistic very quickly. The Church of England is in every colony by the Revolution, and the church is characterized by lay rule. Lay people are running churches in America, and they have much more authority than they do in England. Any thoughts about why that might be, why lay people would be so more important here? Basically, it was just out of need. How's somebody going to get ordained? So remember that our ordination process is that a bishop needs to lay hands on your head with other ordained people. And of course, there's nobody here to do that. So people had to go to England to get ordained, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about what happens as a result of that. But the important thing is that lay people are doing so much more here than they are in England. And that will become a hallmark of the Church in America. Go ahead, Debbie. Thanks.
Is the Harvard
Sorry.
Was the Harvard Theology School, did that focus on a particular religion? In other words, there was Mary and William, but there was also Harvard. So was Harvard being used at the same time?
It was coming. It wasn't, William and Mary was before, but no, it was non-denominational for the most part and has stayed that way. Yep. Good question. Okay. So the two factors in church decline obviously are ties to England during the Revolution. And then the other movement in America that really affects the church is called the Great Awakening. Anybody ever heard of the Great Awakening? It's a very heartfelt, passionate religious movement. It's all about extemporaneous praying. There is no decorum or any concern about any of that in the Great Awakening. It's a very enthusiastic movement. As my friend Mary June Nessler used to say to us, it's classical Protestant doctrine in enthusiastic clothes. So very Protestant, but very enthusiastic. The Great Awakening appeals to less educated folks, and of course the Church of England has become even more educated and elite by this time. Some of you know that this church is known for its elitism that we really had to beat up ourselves about in the 1950s, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. So the Great Awakening really affects the numbers in the Anglican Church too. Revivalism comes out of the Great Awakening. That is a purely American movement, and that pietistic movement will lead to American fundamentalism, which actually begins in 1911. 1911, okay? We'll talk more about that later, but it is a very, very recent movement in America. So back to Anglicanism, there's still no American bishop, because how are we going to go to England when we just broke away from them? So what do we do? And the British, of course, aren't visiting us anymore, so what do we do? Franklin, Washington, Madison, Jay, Henry, they envision an Episcopal church without government ties. And they meet in Maryland in 1780, and they form what is called the First Protestant Episcopal Church. They have the first General Convention in Philadelphia in 1789, and the principles that they set up for the church was a church that was not going to be linked to the government in any way. First thing they did was take the Book of Common Prayer and cross out the king everywhere in it. Number one, they affirmed a threefold ministry in the church, that we would continue to have deacons, priests, and bishops, that we would be Catholic in that way, but that we would be democratic with clergy and laity in every council of the church. And that has stuck with us to this very day. If you go to a church and a priest tells you that you have to believe something or do something, tell them to go jump off a cliff. We don't do that in the Episcopal Church. We make all of those decisions together, lay people and clergy together in every situation, at every level in the church. And we'll talk about that when we get to polity. But of course, that's a very Protestant idea. So the idea is to have this Episcopal Church that is both Protestant and Catholic at the same time, and hold on to both of that. They also required lay participation, and this is probably the biggest contribution of the Episcopal Church in America to the Anglican Communion. And now it's that way in England too. But we brought that whole idea to the whole Anglican Communion. Our polity, how we run our church, is probably the greatest gift that we've given to the whole church. So now we need a bishop. What to do? A guy named Samuel C. Berry is elected to be a bishop. That is another hallmark of the Episcopal Church. We elect our bishops. We were the first part of the Anglican Communion to do that since the early days of the church. So to be a bishop in the Church of England, you had to take an oath to the king. So this is a major issue for us. Apostolic succession, as we talked about last week, remains important. So does anybody know? So I guess you all know that Samuel Seabury does not come off very well in Hamilton, if you know that play very well. But Seabury wasn't a bad guy at all. At any rate, that's beside the point. Does anybody know how we solve this issue of how we're going to get a bishop ordained when we can't go to England and have it and they're not coming to us? So back in the time in the 1600s when England had the Puritans taking over and they threw the church out, a bunch of those folks, they were called non-juring bishops who would not take an oath to the king, left England and went to Scotland, okay? And they formed the next part of the Anglican Church in Scotland. And those non-jurors were the successors of the high Tory English clergy who refused to swear that oath of loyalty to James II. And there you go. So they left and went to Scotland. So that's what we do. We send Samuel Seabury to Scotland to get ordained from these non-juring bishops. I love that because the whole Episcopal Church comes from those non-juring bishops who wouldn't take an oath to the king. That's our legacy in the Episcopal Church, and I find that very cool that's where our roots are. And so we really don't have a direct tie to the mother church in England. Many of our prayers came from the Scottish prayer book at that time and has remained to this day. And here at Grace St. Paul's, just to remind everybody of our connection to the Scottish Church, we do one Eucharistic prayer every year during Lent. That is a Scottish Eucharistic prayer, and I do that just to remind you all that that's our roots, not England, okay? So we wrote prayer books in 1789. Like I said, we just took the king out of it. 1892, 1928. Some of you are very familiar with the 1928 prayer book if you've had any connection to this church. There are still Anglican churches in America today who refuse to use the modern 1979 book and are still using the 1928 prayer book. They have actually been removed from the Episcopal Church. There's one on Ina Road, St. Bede's. They're a 1928 prayer book church. So anyway, just side note there. And then our newest book is 1979. There is a resolution coming up at General Convention this year that says that we will continue to work on prayer books, but we know that we cannot keep up with society anymore writing a book, and that we will be an unbound prayer book church. I'm hoping that passes. As you all know, we are totally unbound here at Grace St. Paul's. We don't let go of our prayer book, but as you know, we do many prayers beyond the prayer book. So that we know that it's impossible to write a book fast enough to keep up with what's going on in contemporary society. So we will write our own prayers and do that to try to keep up. So it's basically what we do here at Grace St. Paul's. So, okay, good. So the church is dying off post-revolution. There were 10,000 Episcopalians out of 4 million Americans. The nation is rural and our church is urban. By 1825, the church is depleted and in dire straits. And what revives the church is this evangelical movement and mission. Mission becomes very important in the American church. We send out missions all over the world. We have a bunch of folks who are involved in all of that. We're also very involved in ecumenism, in trying to work with other Protestant churches to connect. Out of this time comes the Oxford movement, and that is a movement to get back to smells and bells, to have priests wear vestments again, to wear collars and do all those things, to put candles back in churches and that kind of thing. By the 19th century, we had Episcopal missions out of the U.S. to the Far East and Africa, and then to China and Japan and Mexico and the Philippines. And that is how the Anglican Church grew. It is out of the missions that came out of America, not from England. It's the stuff that came out of America that grew the church, for better or worse, and I won't get into that right now either. In the latter half of the 19th century, there are discussions around liturgy which led to that Oxford movement. The other major part of what's going on in the church is social action. So during the Industrial Revolution, the Episcopal Church is very much involved in bringing dignity to people and fighting for humans' rights in that industrial push during that time. Women kind of became the social gospel in the church. There were these women's auxiliary groups and deaconesses that were very much the main part of that social justice movement in the church. And I talked about ecumenism a little bit. By 1927, the Episcopal Church is in the center of the faith and order movement and the ecumenical movement in the whole world. And we became kind of the leaders in that movement. So by the early 1900s, the church becomes one of social witness, foreign mission, and ecumenical cooperation with other churches. And that's kind of what the church got built around, okay? By the beginning of 20th century, the church moved from certain death, from that attachment to England, to becoming an integral part of American life. And some begin to see it as the most important American church. Certainly not the biggest, but it becomes very important in American society. Dino can tell you that in the 1950s, most members of Congress were Episcopalian. And that was not always because they were theologically Episcopalian, but they realized that that was the place to be if you were going to have upwardly mobile movement in your career. All right? Good. Everybody all right? Okay, Dino?
I have a PS to that.
Okay, thank you.
Recording, and I wish I had kept track of it.
Here.
Barry Goldwasser.
You're good.
It's Barry Goldwater and Morris Udall.
Yeah,
We're
thanks.
just having a free-for-all.
Yeah.
And somehow the subject of the first Jewish president, when would that occur and how? And Mo Udall said, clearly, first Jewish president has to be an Episcopalian.
That's our boy. That's our boy. Thank you, Dino. Thank you. All right. Two other major events in the world right before this really affect all of religion. And one is a guy named Charles Darwin, who you may have heard of. Charles Darwin was an Anglican deacon. It's important for people to know that. That seems to have gotten lost in the wash. When The Origin of the Species was written in 1859, there were riots in the streets. I mean, people just went crazy about this. So there was that event, And the other event was something called biblical criticism, which began in Germany. And biblical criticism is the idea that you read the Bible as a book that was written by human beings, and you try to put it in context of when it was written and who it was written to try to understand it. There are many Protestant churches that go crazy about that because, this is when the fundamentalist stuff starts and we get into all this biblical literalism to move away from that. Anglicanism handles both those events, the origin of the species and biblical criticism, and adopts it, and it becomes part of who we are and what we're talking about, while many other denominations want to totally throw that out. And you all know the struggles, especially in this country, around that. It's important to know that that was never the case in the Episcopal Church. We adopted both of those things wholeheartedly. Okay? All right. In the Civil War, the Episcopal Church is the only church in America that does not split in half. Of all the Protestant churches, all of them split down the middle, okay? Except the Episcopal Church, for better or for worse, okay? And we held this church together through all of that. And that was not always pretty, I will say, because I would suggest, this is me personally talking now, that we did not take the stands that we should have taken against slavery, etc., in the Civil War to hold the church together. That would change dramatically later, but at that time, we're the only church that stayed together. And I'll just leave it right there. So the church really has become a national church at that time, and that's a big part of who we are. 1946, we had our first full-time national leader. Henry Knox Sherrill was elected our presiding bishop, and instead of it just being another bishop in the church, he spent all of his time trying to hold this national church together. He also served as the first president of the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches, still very important to us in the church. And he was determined to bring more unity to American Episcopalians, okay? Sherrill, Henry Knox Sherrill. So, from 1946 to 1960, that became the greatest period of growth in the Episcopal Church. We just expanded tremendously and our numbers just grew amazingly. And that came to a big halt in 1960. And that was because of the Civil Rights Movement. And now, in 1960, we took a stand. And, Southern churches left in droves, whole churches left the Episcopal Church when we took a very, very strong stand for civil rights as a church. And that, that obviously stays with us today. The other movement that was happening during civil rights in the church was the role of women in the church, and that became a major issue. And more churches left in droves because as we made women, gave women positions of power in the church. The church addressed black issues very directly. Under John Hines as presiding bishop, social activism became the central thing in the church. He said, we will consciously devote our efforts to black concerns, and that is who we became as a church. The next big issue of contention was the role of women in the church. And this is almost embarrassing to say out loud, but I have to tell you, the first woman to serve at General Convention in the church was in 1970. Some of you were here when we showed the movie, The Philadelphia 11. The Philadelphia 11 is the movie about the first 11 women who were ordained a priest in this church. That was done without the permission of the wider church. We just ordained them anyway because we believed that that was the right thing to do. And in 1976, the rest of the church came in and passed a resolution at convention that women could be ordained. But those first 11 were ordained without the recommendation of the whole church. The priests that were involved in that ordination were very, very brave folks. The point I want to make about this is how we make changes in the Episcopal Church. It's always from the ground up. It's always grassroots. And it's just what we're doing here at Grace St. Paul's. The church is not on board with everything that we're doing here, but we're going to do it, and we're going to show the church that that's... And I am so happy to say that that works. It's one of the main reasons I'm Episcopalian. Things can change in our lifetime. And I'll just give you one example. The season of creation. We have a season of creation here where we link people to God through creation. I started doing season of creation liturgies 21 years ago. When I started, there was, I don't know, maybe a dozen churches in the country doing this, not just Anglican, but all denominations. And last year, in the book of occasional services, we have a season of creation with prayers in it for the whole church. 20 years. That's a really short time in church history. So I'm really, really proud of that. But the point I'm trying to make is that's how we change things in the church, and it works. And it's not always comfortable, but that's the way things get changed. Okay? All right. In 1980, the Episcopal Church is voted in one of those Pew Research things as the most progressive of 23 religions on the question of racial justice. In 1985, Edmund Browning, our presiding bishop, said that there will be no outcasts in this church, and diversity became our strength as a congregation and as a denomination. In 1991, Episcopal President George Bush, preparing for war in Iraq, Edmund Browning told him to reconsider and actually had some sway with George Bush at the time. Those days are long gone too, but yeah, that's where we were. So that's kind of how all this happened. Some of you know that Gene Robinson was ordained a bishop in New Hampshire in, I don't remember the year now, 1990. Anyway, Gene Robinson was our first openly gay bishop to be ordained in the church. But that is who we are now. We are a church open to all, accepting of all, across the wide range of theology, and social justice is what we are all about, okay? So the Episcopal Church has its own polity, and we run our church by ourselves. It's not connected to England or Scotland or anything else. But all the Anglican churches in the whole world, we consider ourselves connected to all of those churches, and we are connected through what we call bonds of affection, which means that we like each other. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But that's what holds us together, not our theology, not our social justice. And as some of you know, we're pulling much of the church along in some of those areas. But that's who we are. Okay? Okay, well, I'm going to stop right there. So you can, that's a lot of information. What do you want to ask me? So I'm thinking about Mormonism, looking at you, Phoebe. So I haven't forgotten. We'll talk about all of the denominations in America that started in America and nowhere else that were created here. Mormonism is one of many, all of which started in like the 1850s and 1860s in this country. We'll talk about all those in a later class, okay? It's such a strange phenomenon in the United States that all these denominations started here so recently. But we'll talk about all them. Mormonism is one of many that started in that time. Yes, sir. Thanks.
You stated we have the bonds of affection within the Anglican Church.
Yes.
What power or hold does the Creed of Nicaea, what did that do, the Nicene Creed, or regarding the church? Like it was an agreement, a bunch of bishops met, and they agreed upon a liturgy.
Right.
Does that still have any hold within a contemporary Episcopal church?
Yeah. I mean, you're asking the big question there. So we talked about how the Nicene Creed was formed in the 300s in the last class, and the questions that they were trying to answer at the time. So, as of today, what it says in the 1979 prayer book is that we will do the Nicene Creed at every Sunday service in the church. Let's read what it actually says. Somebody pull that book out there and let me stop paraphrasing and we'll say what it actually says. I'm getting close. There it is. Okay, so the rubric is, it's not in our bulletin. The rubric says, on Sundays and other major feasts, there follows, all standing, the Nicene Creed. So as of right now, the Nicene Creed remains the central affirmation of faith in the church. Okay? Now, as you all know, we are attempting to change that here at Grace St. Paul's because it is, again, impossible to describe to people where that creed came from in the body of a Sunday worship. And we'll go through the whole creed in another class, okay? We'll go through it line by line and talk about where all that stuff came from. But these are fights about how we understand God in the 4th century. First of all, some of that stuff doesn't make any sense to us at all anymore. Is it an important historical document of the church? Yes. Does it mean something to us today? Yeah, if we read it in context and understand it. So, here at Grace St. Paul's, I am trying to honor that tradition, remember, scripture, reason, tradition, we continue to do the Nicene Creed every week at our 7:45 service, okay? And at 10 o'clock, we sometimes use the creed, but more often use another affirmation of faith. And I try to choose an affirmation of faith that speaks to the lectionary of the day, what biblical readings we're doing, and also speaks to how we understand things theologically in the 21st century in Tucson, Arizona. And I think that's important to bring that together. My hope is that at next General Convention, that rubric will change because of people like us. So the answer is yes, the Nicene Creed is still the central affirmation of faith in the church. And that's across the whole Anglican communion. But I think that's starting to shift. Is that good? Okay. You guys are asking good questions. All the stuff that I haven't thought about saying. Anybody? Debbie?
Is there a short history of most of the things you've covered for people?
Yep, there is a book called The History of the Episcopal Church. I'll try to bring it next week, okay, and give you that. Yeah, I kind of flew over the whole thing, but yeah, there's a book that I got this from multiple sources. What I'm doing, but there is a book that does a general thing. Yeah.
Does the Episcopal Church does it now, or did it ever use the Apostles' Creed?
Yeah, so in the back of the prayer book, you will find all of our historical documents, and one of them is the Apostles' Creed. And we basically use the Apostles' Creed at baptisms. We just set it up in question and answer thing. So the question and answer baptismal covenant thing that we do at baptisms, that's the Apostles' Creed. Yep. Yep, good question. Good. Jennifer.
This we may be saved for another time, but I'm curious, you mentioned again about reasons why you're Episcopalian.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to at some point share your story of your journey to the Episcopalian Church?
If you'd like.
I
Yeah.
would, at
Okay.
some point.
Okay, yep. Yep, I will do that. I will do that. Those of us who have gotten ordained, we have to share that story so many times in this process. But I'm happy to share it with all of you too. You should all know. And I think you've all heard little pieces of it in sermons, but I'm happy to share that as a whole thing, sure.
I'm just trying to weave together this phenomenon that the Episcopal Church never divided during the Civil War.
Yeah.
And yet I understand, I'm trying to figure out the Episcopal Church in the South, because I understand that especially among white people, that it's a church of highly educated, like doctors and lawyers.
Yes.
And lower income white people in the South tend to be Baptists. And I'm trying to figure out how does that tie in, because the church sounds so progressive on the one hand. I'm just trying to weave together these different phenomena. I don't know.
Yeah, so are all of us. Yeah, I mean, this church was much more evangelical, and so let me say that quickly too. There's nothing pejorative about the word evangelical. We came out of a whole evangelical background. That word got stolen from us by the fundamentalists, who we'll talk about in a later session. So I don't mean that word pejoratively. I mean, it's a good word. And this church was much more evangelistic and evangelical in its early days, after post-revolution and until we got to 1900. So that church was fine with not battling all these social justice issues. So they didn't. So in the 1800s, we were in a period of time where we just said, okay, we're the via media. That's what Elizabeth I said we were, and we're going to be that. We're going to be a church for all people. We're going to be this big tent church where everybody's allowed in here. So they attempted to do that through the Civil War. So they never took a stand on slavery as a church. And that's how we stayed together. When all the other churches did, and they split right down the center. And I mean, that's still the same today. The Presbyterians, the Lutherans, they all, and we'll run through all those denominations later. We didn't do that. So is that a good thing? Holding everybody together for the sake of slavery? I'll give you my personal opinion. Hell no. What, that doesn't make any sense to me. But I get it. I mean, the church had already almost collapsed because of the revolution, and they're trying to build themselves back. I get why they made that decision and why they did it, but I just find that unconscionable. So I would have had a really difficult time, I will tell you, being an Episcopalian in 1950. It would have been really difficult for me. But in 1960, when we said no more, and we're gonna take a stand in civil rights, and we don't care who leaves as a result, I mean, that's my church, and that's a church. So, and we've taken on all of those issues one after the other, and with each one, other groups of people left the church, and that's why the church is so small in the South right now. It's still there, and there are plenty of people who think like I do, and others do, and have stayed a part of the church. But during women's ordination, the ordination and the ordination of LGBTQ folks and marrying LGBTQ folks in the church, and by the way, we were doing that here at Grace St. Paul's way before the church was on board. That's just happened in the last 10 years. People left the church in droves during those times, and I'm happy about that, because if you can't be I don't know what we're doing here if we can't be taking care of people and representing everybody. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. It's, in the 1800s, we didn't take those stands, so we stayed together. I can tell I'm not answering your question, though.
I'm just wondering why social class differences exist. Why is it rich people?
Oh, why are rich people in the Episcopal Church?
In the South, I understand that in the South, rich people like to go to, rich white people go to the Episcopal Church, and middle class and working class.
Yep. Okay, I think I can help with that. Yep. So the question was, for everybody live streaming, why is it that, especially in the South, upper class and rich folks tend to be Episcopalian and not other traditions? I would say that this was a church of elite folks for many, many years across the spectrum. And through the 1950s, we were that church for everybody, not just in the South, everywhere. And I think it stayed in the South because those folks still were going to church for reasons other than social justice issues. So the church that you see in the South there now is the church that I believe you would have seen anywhere in America in the 1950s. And that's why so many people, so many Episcopalians were in such positions of leadership in the country during those times. And in 1960, when we took a stand on civil rights, that really changed. That really changed. And the folks in the South who had those issues had already left the church. I hope that helps. Okay. How are we doing? We got 2 minutes. Okay, we made it. All right, so no class next week, okay? And then we'll start up the following week. And what are we doing? 3 is liturgy and the Book of Common Prayer, right? That's class 3. Did I do that right? I'm sure I'm right. Okay. So not next Sunday, but the following Sunday. And I'll just give you a little heads up on that. So we'll go through the history of the prayer book and how all that came about and what that looks like. And we'll also talk about liturgy, why we worship the way we do and what that looks like, all right? And I will do that both from the Episcopal Church's perspective and my personal take on liturgy. And I'll tell you why we do what we do here and why the church does what it does, okay? Good? Thank you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Join us each week in discussion of the sermon and Grace St. Paul's unique ministries at gsptucson.org/forum. We look forward to seeing you again soon.